3 of the oldest myth in the Bible. In part 3, we're going to be moving to some more metaphorical or literary uses of this ancient idea of dragons, leviathans in the Hebrew Bible. Last week, we spent our time on two particular Psalms, Psalm 74 and Psalm 89. In these Psalms, there seems to be a link back to the creation account or the ordering of the cosmos. There seem to be stories linking back to that event or that idea, with one really strange little twist, which we don't find in the Genesis account, and that is this idea that at that event, God kind of gets into a fight with a sea monster, slays it, and out of that comes forth the ordering of the cosmos and the rest of creation. Today we're going to move on a little bit further. We're going to move to some more metaphorical uses of this idea. Now, if this idea was prevalent in ancient Israel, it does make sense that some of the writers of the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible would have used it as a literary theme, a type of a trope, and would have weaved it into some other accounts. And that's exactly what we do find in the rather later writings of the Hebrew Bible. The star for today's show is the book of Job. Surprisingly, the book of Job is probably the book that refers back the most to this ancient trope. Now, as far as we know, the book of Job is understood to be a book of poetry, an incredible book of poetry, and should rather be read as thus. But it then also makes sense that in this amazing book of ancient Hebrew poetry, we would find these type of tropes. And the writers of the book of Job really plays really well. And it's amazing. I mean, they were really incredible the way they weave this theme, this trope, into the book of Job. Now, although the book of Job is set in possibly a patriarchal times, which means before the monarchy was established, scholars are quite certain, or the scholarly consensus is that the book was written much, much later, probably in the 6th to 5th century. So we're talking about exile time, if you know the history of Israel. All right, so let's dive into some of these more metaphorical or literary uses of this trope. In other words, what we mean by that is the writer is trying to convey a message and uses as a base layer the idea of God slaying the Leviathan to produce some other wished outcome. All right, so let's have a look at this. The first one is found in Job 3, verse 8. And I encourage you to go read this on your own when you have some time. It's really, really good poetry, and it's really, really well done. And you might have done this before and seen some of these ideas. And maybe you have not, because the writers let me rather say the translators of the book of Job in our Bibles, often when the word Leviathan should be used, it uses a completely different word. And so kind of it disguises, it dulls down this ancient trope and kind of hides it from the modern reader. So let's have a quick look. Job 3, verse 8. What happens in Job 3, verse 8? Job is upset. You know what happened to Job? He lost everything. It's a terrible story. And he starts literally cursing the day that he was born. The writers then of this poem about Job starts using creation as a motif, but in reverse. In other words, in Job 3, verse, from verse 1 to around verse 9, they reverse creation back and use this as a measure of how terrible Job's birth was to himself, in such a way that he curses it, hoping to be able to reverse it. He wished that it had never happened and that he could reverse this day of his creation, which is a day of cursing, right? So Job starts to curse the day that he was born. The writers of the passage use a kind of a creation reversal motive or idea to plot out the day of his birth. In this portion, creation is reversed. But look what we find in this. So I'm just going to paraphrase very, very briefly. Verse 3 to 4, he says, let the day and the night perish. Right, now, okay, the day and the night that he was born? Yeah, possibly. But as we go on, you'll see that this is actually seems to be a poke back at the creation. There was a time when day and night was created, and now it must perish. It must reverse. Verse 5 says, let darkness come and don't let the light shine. Once again, this is a reversal of creation in which the darkness was and light came into being and pushed out the darkness. But in this beautiful poem, there's a reversal of this that takes place. No, don't let the light rule. Don't let the light shine. Let darkness come back into being. Then in verse 6, it says, and let there be no day and no month. Now, this seems to be also a reversal of what happens in the creation account, specifically like in Genesis, we know, and also what we've seen from Psalm 74. In the creation account, there's the setting in motion of the seasons, the time periods and the seasons. But here in this portion, he says, no day and no month. The moon would be obviously the heavenly body that would regulate the months, as we all know. And he's reversing all of that. Now, I'm going to jump verse 8 and just go straight to verse 9, and we'll come back to it. In verse 9, he says, let the stars go dark. In other words, even there's a reversal of the heavenly bodies. So if you can have a look at what's happening here, it seems quite clear that the writers are using creation in a reverse way to try and tell us how terrible Job thinks of the day that he was created, and he wished that it could be undone. All right, so that's not a controversial issue at all. It's beautiful poetry. But in verse 8 of chapter 3, there's another reversal that takes place that once again is not found in Genesis explicitly, but that we do find, as we saw last week, in Psalm 74 and Psalm 89. Curse the day, raise the Leviathan. All right, now, the problem with this here is that in my Bible, my King James, I use the King James, the word Leviathan is translated the morning as an M-O-U-R. In other words, the crying, the sadness. Let the sadness start. Let the morning start. Why in the world would translators take the word Leviathan and translate it as morning? Well, I can understand why, because it's going to cause a lot of confusion. It's going to, what type of benefit could that be to the reader? And later, monotheistic Christian writers did not like the idea of a Leviathan at creation. And so when we do read Leviathan into this passage, it makes a lot of sense. Referencing Psalm 74 and Psalm 89 we handled last week. In those Psalms, there seems to be an allusion to God defeating some type of sea monster. It was called Leviathan, Canaan, and Rahab in those two chapters, those two portions. Those are the three names that seem to be the same thing. He seemed to kill this thing, and out of that comes the creation of everything. So it does make a lot of sense that the writers, or at least the initial or the redactors of the 6th or the 5th century, would still hold to that type of trope. That in order to reverse the creation, the day, the night, from light back to darkness, from seasons of days and months back to no order in that regards, from stars back to no stars, that you would also have to raise up the Leviathan, because in creation, for them, the Leviathan was first slain. It had to be killed. It was killed, Psalm 74. So this is a beautiful example of the writers of Job using this ancient trope of God fighting the Leviathan and using it almost in a by-the-way way in reversing creation. And in order to reverse creation, you have to also raise the Leviathan, meaning that at creation, Leviathan had to be slain. All right, it's a beautiful example, beautiful poetry. Let's move on a little bit to Job 7, verse 12. Now here, Job is lamenting the fleeting and the miserable nature of the life of man. It seems like in general, of course, he's including himself, and he's longing for its end, his own death, right? So not only is he cursing the day he was born, but now he's ready to die, basically, right? So he takes courage and he starts speaking his mind, and he complains about his terrible life that's so short and so miserable. In verse 12, he asks God if he is a sea or a tannin that God continues to scare, and the word there means to break him down by violence, confusion, and fear in his dreams, on his couch, in his bed, so that he would rather choose the strangling of death than his own life. So, what's happening here? And we're going to read it in a moment. But Job has a question. The question comes from a place of complete despair. And his despair is that even when he sleeps, he is tormented by God on his couch or slash bed in his dreams. So much so that he would rather die. How does he make this torment known? How do the writers of this portion make this torment known? What do they equate it with? What is the allegory they use? They're referring back again to this tannin idea. Now, once again, our Bibles translates it as a whale, right? And it's a slightly ridiculous in my view, but the real word there is tannin, right? Which is a word we find a cognitive for in the Ugaritic language, and we'll do that next week, having a look at the external evidence for this type of motif. But for today, we're just sticking to the Hebrew dragons, right? And so he is tormented and he asks God, am I a sea or am I a tannin, this type of dragon sea monster that you are constantly tormenting me? Which means that you can't make that argument in your writing about Job unless you assume that God does or has had a serious conflict with the sea or with the tannin in the sea. Right. So once again, they're using this ancient trope to explain how terrible Job feels. He feels like he's the Leviathan and God is punishing him. Like a sea or a tannin, God continues to scare Job so that he can't find rest on his bed and he wants to end his life. This literary device here is based on the presumption that the sea or the tannin is a type of enemy of God that attracts the violence of God unto death. Unfortunately, again, King James translates tannin as a whale. Now, for what reason a whale would attract the punishment and the torment of God, I'm not sure. It doesn't make sense, but it does make sense if you're trying to hide this old myth. It makes a lot more sense to understand that Job here, through the writers, is referring back to this ancient chaos camp, this war with chaos, and Job feels like God is equating him to this chaos, and therefore God is kind of at war with him. The translation of whalia makes very little sense as an enemy of God that attracts this type of punishment. Let's move on to Job 26 and verse 12. So here, Job connects the crushing of Rahab with Sheol and the fleeing serpent, a created and a tamed entity. All right, so just briefly, Tannin, Leviathan, and Rahab seems to be the three terms that is used and identified with this old ancient idea that God slayed a dragon at creation, basically, right? But as the biblical writers move on, they start to demythologize this idea. So what you'd find is in some of the older portions, like Psalm 74 and 89, it's quite simple. God slays a monster at creation. But later on, the writers transform this monster, sea dragon, sea monster, tannin, Leviathan, Rahab. And it becomes kind of something, the changes look like this. Number one, God created him, right? And now God tamed him. And he's now kind of like a pet animal in the sea that worships God. That's kind of the transformation that eventually is applied to this early myth. And the process is understood to be a demythologizing. In other words, they will do things like translate tannin as whale or translate Leviathan as morning. And so they're taking out the mythical elements from our scripture because they don't want us to see it. They don't feel it's relevant. Obviously, they're probably sincere. They didn't believe it was true, and then it must have been a mistake. But we know now from the external evidence that this was a very well-established myth in the ancient Near East. All right. So here in Job 26, we see evidences of such a demythologizing, where the monster is no longer the initial enemy of God, the chaos seas and Leviathan that God has to destroy, crush, wound before he can bring order to the chaos. No, now the Leviathan has become a creature that's in the sea that God made, that God kind of tamed. And later on, we find even evidences of God forcing this thing to worship him. So the Leviathan becomes pet whale, pet dragon, if you like. Now, here in Job 26, verse 12, Job is attributing deeds and characteristics to God. He says in verse 5, and I'm just paraphrasing for the time of sake, dead things are formed under the seas and its inhabitants. Verse 6, Sheol is naked before him. Sheol in the old Hebrew was the place of the netherworld, the place of the dead. It was seen to be under the seas, under the earth. And so there's a lot of death imagery that happens in this portion. Verse 10, he compassed the waters with bounds until the day and night came to an end. The pillars of heaven tremble at his rebuke. There's a lot of creation type of talk here again about the boundaries of the waters that were set, that day and night motif, and also the pillars of heaven, which is an old ancient cosmological idea. Verse 12 says, he decides the sea with his power. Now here we see God is wrestling with the sea again, right? But in a bit more demythologized version. And by his understanding, he crushes Rahab. So we have the idea of God fighting with Rahab again. But it seems to be morphing into metaphoric language, like by his understanding, he crushes. But verse 13 is very important. So verse 12 says, by his understanding, he crushes Rahab. Verse 13 says, that was verse 12. Verse 13 says, his hands has formed the crooked serpent. All right. So it seems here that in Hebrew parallelism, Rahab here is identified as a crooked or meaning fleeing serpent. Right. And this is incredibly important. Make a mental note of this as we move onward. But we do see the element of demythologizing this serpent here in that God made him, right? So he's not something God has to fight before God makes animals, like in the earlier versions. In this version, God, he is just one of the created animals, but still something that need to be fought, still something that need to be crushed. You can see quite clear evolutionary ideas or the evolution of this idea through some of these portions. But we need to make a note that this animal, whatever it was mythic. It never existed, right? But his hands formed it, and it is called the crooked or the fleeing serpent. Make a mental note of that because that becomes incredibly important as we move on, right? It seems like this is a term that is borrowed from Canaanite ancient myths. All right, let's move on. Special attention in this portion is given to the deep or the waters of the deep, where the Rahab lives and where he gets crushed. It could have been female, I'm sure. Also, mention is made of a fleeing or a crooked serpent, and it seems to be identified with Rahab. And we're going to address that later because that becomes incredibly important. Moving on to Job 41, verse 2. And if you're wondering what we're doing right now, we're just slowly walking through all the references in the old Hebrew scriptures concerning Leviathan, Tannin, and Rahab. In Job 41, verse 2, is also, which seems to be a demythologized account of this early chaos camp, in which God is taming this wild thing that he created. And I think in this portion, he actually tames him to the place where he has to worship God. But let's have a look. God addresses Job with indignation in Job 40 and 41, asking him if Job will contend with him. It's a very famous portion. God lists all his own amazing attributes and conquests, right? Obviously, it's the writers doing this, but on God's behalf. Among these, we find in Job chapter 41, verse 1 to 2, God drawing the Leviathan with a hook through the nose, it seems. He draws him out by the tongue, by the letting down cord. It's like he's fishing. God goes fishing in the sea and catches the Leviathan. And God puts a hook into his nose punctures his nose with a thorn, which I guess is another word for the hook. Here we have an ancient depiction, again, of the conflict between God and the sea monster, the Leviathan. And the writers here uses this old idea to bolster up the reputation of God as he confronts Job. So basically, on God's CV here for the writers in Job is the day he tamed the Leviathan, the day he conquered the Leviathan. Now, this conflict was known to the writers of Job, obviously. They use this over and over again. And they use it in a poetic nature, in a literary nature in the book of Job that we have today. Even if they, the writers at this point, no longer believed that there existed an actual Leviathan in the actual seas and deeps, what we are getting is that they are familiar with an ancient myth, that there was this type of conflict between God and this monster. It was definitely familiar with them. Now, Job seems to be the book in which almost the most mentions of this happens, but it's not isolated. Second, I think, in the race is the book of Psalms, which is also a book of songs and poetry, where we find this motif come up quite a lot. Let's move on to Psalms 44. Here we find the canon of chaos, desolation, and death. The psalmist seems to lament the scattering and the desolation of the people of Israel. Possibly the psalm is referring to what happened to them in the Babylonian exile. And the writer then continues to add in verse 19, God has broken them in the place of Canaan and covered us with the shadow of death. So, in some sense, here, once again, they're drawing on this ancient motif, where there's conflict between God and the dragon. And here, conflict between God and Israel, because it's the reason for the exile was conflict between God and Israel. Israel was idolatrous, so God came down and gave him a smack. It's literarily equated to this ancient idea of God fighting with the Tannan, or the dragons. So we have metaphorical use of death, the deep here, as the place of the dragon. That's something we've seen in the previous portion as well. Tannan, a condition the Israelites at this point spiritually infleshed. They were dead. They had no temple, they had no land, they were out. Chaos and death then is here also associated with the Tannan. Right. Now to some examples that further demythologizes this ancient motif. In Psalm 104, verse 26, we find a version of the creation or the ordering of the cosmos. This is another creation story. And this is a great example of the demythologizing that takes place in the Hebrew scriptures. Just some paraphrasing from verse 2. God stretches out the heavens like a curtain, like this is talking about creation event. He lays the beams of the upper chambers of the sky in the waters, right? The pillars, the things that hold up the sky. He lays the foundation of the earth in verse 5. In verse 6, he covers the deep like a garment, the water above the mountains. This is a creation type of story. You can quite clearly here see the ancient biblical cosmology, which was an ancient Mesopotamian cosmology. Now listen to verse 8 says, the waters flee the rebuke and haste away. So this is weird because the waters now, they got to run from God. Like, it's this metaphorical, sure, but God is in conflict with the waters. He sends them out. He divides them. He fights them to do his bidding. Verse 9, setting a bound, they, the waters, cannot pass again to cover the earth. This is the horizontal separation of the waters in the Genesis account. I'm just equating it to the Genesis account. He appointed the moon, for seasons, and the sun. He made darkness and night. O Lord, how manifold are thy works. So this is a rather clear reflection of what the writer understood to be the creation account, or the ordering of the cosmos account. But of course, in these older accounts, who always rears its head is the snake, right? I call them a snake, the fleeing serpent, the Leviathan, the Rahab, the Tannan. O Lord, how manifold are your works, verse 24. The earth is full of your riches. Verse 25. The great and the wide sea with creatures innumerable. And verse 26. There is that Leviathan that you made. All right, so in Psalm 104, Leviathan is demoted from an arch enemy, in other words, a pre existing chaos that needs to be confronted. Now it's just something God made and put in the sea. So Leviathan is demoted from an enemy to be defeated in order to bring forth order to the chaos, to a created, a tame, a playful creature of the sea, like a dog that awaits feeding from God. This is a progression in the idea of the Leviathan. Now, I know that some of you read the Bible as in it was all written at the same time by the same person, but the reality is the Bible is multi-layered. It's the ideas, some of the ideas in the Bible are really, really ancient, like this mythical idea about the sea monster and the god fighting the sea, or personification of the sea, which is the sea monster, is really, really old. We're talking probably 3rd millennium BC at least. So these ideas were not created in the moment they were written in the 5th century. They are very old, and over time ideas morph as they are transferred from generation to generation. It's just a very natural process that takes place. Right, so this is an interesting reference and stands in contrast to the other references where the tannin or the Leviathan is an enemy that is crushed and attracts the violence of God. We will say more about this later, but just in short, the most early ideas of Chaos Kampf are demythologized as later writers engage the older stories or possibly literature. The fierce sea monster of chaos becomes a tame whale. You know, well, they didn't use the word whale. We use the word whale, but in a modern sense, that's what we do with these portions. We adopt the later idea that, oh, he's just talking about a whale that's in, yeah, he had a bit of a fight. Yeah, it's nothing, you know, he's just a created creature. But the origin of this idea is much older. And the origin of this idea is a real creation myth of violence between God and the Leviathan that brings in, that ushers in order. Okay, now I'll move on. Psalm 148. Here in Psalm 148, we see one more step in the process of demythologizing the tannin. Here he comes to worship God. A psalm of praise to Yahweh, calling heavens, angels, moon, sun, moon, stars, waters above. See the ancient cosmology there. It's referring back to that ancient cosmology. It's got connections to creation. Because he commanded and he created. But in verse 7, it says, praise the Lord from the earth, ye tannin and all deeps. So here we almost have the final form. No, it's not the final form. The final form is found in Genesis. We'll get there. But a very late development, it seems, of this ancient myth is that not only is the chaos monster Leviathan, Tannin, Rahab not an enemy of God that God has to kill before he can create, also he's not just something God made that fights with God, but here in this portion, the Leviathan is called to worship. In other words, he is now literally a lapdog. Right. So the tannin is called to praise. He's become a fan. No longer an arch enemy. With the created cosmos, and only later are the animals and humans called into the same praise. But still the tannin here in this portion is placed separate from the other living creatures, mammals, all the animals, and even humans, as a special part of the creation. And that seems to stem back through to this very, very early myth. All right, now a final section for today. And this is our final references to the appearance of tannin, or of the dragons, the Hebrew dragons in the biblical account, is that often writers would also use this idea, this motif, this ancient motif, as a metaphor for the enemies of Israel. Right. So, for instance, one of the more clear ones is that Rahab, the dragon, is often used as an allegory for God's enemy, Egypt. Now, if you've been with us through Exodus, through ancient eyes, you'll realize that in some large sense, Exodus is a battle between Yahweh and the gods of Egypt, proxied by Moses and the Pharaoh. Egypt and their gods are the enemies of God, and the later writers would use Rahab as an epithet for Egypt. Right, so Psalm 87, verse 4. I will make mention of Rahab and Babylon, to let them know me, behold, Philistia and Tyre with Ethiopia. This man was born there. Okay, so the point here is just Rahab is mentioned in place of a nation. And we know from the other portions we'll go to now that this is normally an epithet for Egypt. So, now let's go to one of the very, very famous portions of Leviathan. And I saw posts this week of people using this in a very weird way, as if it's some future battle between God and Satan. And I think that's one of the problems of not understanding the ancient context of these scriptures, is that we then get to interpret it any way we like. But in Isaiah 27, verse 1, right, so this portion of Isaiah is what's called Proto-Isaiah. It's the earliest form of Isaiah, believed to have been written during the actual life of the prophet of Isaiah, which we're talking about the 8th century BCE, and that's rather early. This is approximately during the time, or during before the time of the Assyrian exile of the northern tribes of Israel. Isaiah employs this ancient motif of the sea monster. He employs it as a literary device in order to proclaim God's judgment on the enemies of Israel, most probably here referring to the mighty Assyrians. Right, they were mighty, these guys, of his contemporary time, claiming that they will be judged by God. Isaiah uses this older mythical motif here to illustrate that just as God defeated the sea monster, so he is coming for Israel's enemies, which here probably means the Assyrians. Now let me read for you Isaiah 27:1. In that day, the Lord, Yahweh, with his sore and great and strong sword, will punish Leviathan, the piercing or the fleeing serpent. Remember in Job we had that portion, the crooked and fleeing or fleeing serpent. Here in Isaiah, Leviathan is given the same title, which is one of the reasons why we equate Rahab and Leviathan. Right? He says, even Leviathan, that crooked serpent, and he shall slay the dragon that is in the sea. Now, I don't think that Isaiah meant this as future tense, that God's one day going to fight a monster in the sea. I think what's really happening here is this is actually a reference to God coming to judge Assyria. But what does Isaiah use metaphorically to illustrate what's going to happen to Assyria is he looks back in time and draws on the motive of God defeating the monster of the sea, the Leviathan, the crooked and fleeing serpent, the piercing serpent. As we looked at in Psalm 74, this thing had more than one head. We don't know how many exactly. And he uses that to write poetically or prophetically, if you like, about the future of Assyria. Interestingly here, Isaiah connects the Leviathan with the fleeing serpent, which is what we find in Job 26:13. Same is said of Rahab, the dragon of the sea. They seem to be the same thing, or at least they represent the same idea in the mind of the writers. Now back to the idea of Egypt as Rahab. In Isaiah 30, verse 7, it says, for the Egyptians shall help in vain and to no purpose. Therefore have I cried concerning this. Their strength is to sit still. Okay, so it's a weird, that last portion is weird. It doesn't make much sense until you realize that the word for strength here is rahab. And then it makes a little bit more sense, because what it's trying to tell you is that the Egyptians, Rahab, will be still. They won't be able to help. And this obviously was a real indignation against Israel always, is that they ran to Egypt for help. But in this case, the Israelites will run. The basically Egypt will be neutralized. Rahab will be neutralized. The Israelites will run. In, the Israelites will run to Egypt for help, or to help, or to get to be rescued from the Assyrians. But Rahab, Egypt will be still. You'll be stopped. You'll do nothing. Isaiah 51 verse 9, we find creation motif of Tannan and Rahab through Exodus and for the exile. So this one is very interesting, and I think this will be the last one for today, second to last. All right. So Isaiah 51 is called Deuter Isaiah and is written much later than the first portion of Isaiah, probably in the 6th century, but under threat of Babylonian exile. In other words, the enemy here in this portion is most probably the mighty Babylonians. Right. Now, Israel lies in ruins. So this is probably concerning their exile to Babylon. And Isaiah is calling on God to come to her aid. As he came to her aid, as he came to the aid of Israel in Egypt. So there's three things going on here. There's the Babylonian reality of the Israelites being exiled. There's the reference back to how God saved them in the Exodus from the Egyptians. And then finally, there's a layer that underlies all of these, the fight of God with Leviathan. And let's have a look how this pans out. Isaiah uses a very layered approach to convey this powerful call. All right, so here are the layers. If you want to follow with me just for a moment, just apply your mind to this for a moment. At the very top of these layers is what Isaiah is actually trying to say. He's distressed because Israel is scattered, exiled by the Babylonians. Right? Now, in his poetic or prophetic utterance here against Babylon, he recalls the Exodus. He conjures up, reminds people of the power of God displayed in the Exodus. So the second layer to this is not just what is currently happening or contemporaneously happening with the Babylonians, but he is referring back to the Exodus. So the second layer is the actual Exodus, where God called the Israelites from Egypt. But what's very interesting here is, of course, he also calls them through the sea. He has to part the seas in order for them to come out. And it's in the seas where the Pharaoh dies, etc. But this, even the recalling of the Exodus from Egypt, also relies on and draws from an older idea, which is God cutting the Leviathan, or the Rahab in this case. The third and possibly base layer of this polemic is the very oldest myth of God cutting the Rahab and wounding the Tannan at the act of creation as he separates the waters of the great deep. So you can see how these things fit together. Of course, just on the side here, block your ears if you're already getting too much information, but a lot of scholars believe that even the Exodus account is embellished with creation accounts. So that the parting of the sea and them going through on dry land really is a mythologized version, or draws on the mythology of creation. But anyway, let's leave that there. Let's read it. Isaiah 51 verse 9. Awake, awake, put on strength, O arm of Yahweh. Awake as in the ancient days, in the generations of old. Art thou not he that cuts Rahab and wounds the Tannan, the dragon? Are you not? See, that was the initial myth. Now we move on to the, it seems like we move on to the Egyptian account. Art thou not it which had dries the sea, the waters of the great deep, that made the depths of the sea a way for the ransom to pass over? Basically, Isaiah is calling on the Creator God that defeated the chaos monster of the deep at creation, who then delivered Israel from the power of Egypt and through the Red Sea, to come and save the Israelites that have been exiled in Babylon. In Ezekiel, and this is our last one for today, your timing is good. Ezekiel 29 verse 3 and Ezekiel 32 verse 2. Here, Ezekiel prophesies against Egypt, and he calls Pharaoh the great Tannan that lies in the midst of the rivers, and that God will put hooks in his jaws and pull him out of the river. This sounds a lot like what we had in Job 41. Well, this could very well just easily be because this account of God judging Egypt and Pharaoh is again drawing on this much older idea of God drawing, fishing the Leviathan out of the seas. Verse 32, chapter 32, verse 2 says, "You are a tannin in the seas." Now, what really overlaps beautifully is the idea that there's the Nile and this, they have the Nile crocodiles. If you know what a Nile crocodile looks like, it's a ferocious type of dinosaur, I guess. So this works nicely together. There's crocodiles in the river. This plays beautifully on the ancient idea of God fighting a monster in the sea. And so this prophecy against Egypt is beautifully layered and masterfully put together to relay that ancient myth, but in the reality of what Egypt was. Only surface reading of this passage can reduce the interpretation of tannin here to a crocodile. But Ezekiel, like the writers of Isaiah, is drawing on a much older motif that overlaps nicely with the idea of Pharaoh as the great Nile crocodile. Pharaoh is pictured as an enemy of God, like the sea dragon, that has to be judged and tamed by God. The idea of Tannin or Rahab is much older than Israel's history with Egypt. And I think this is an important point to make, that this motif of God fighting sea monsters or the sea personified is way older than the story of Exodus. Even if the story of Exodus was written down by Moses in the 13th century, the motif of God fighting the sea monster is much, much older. So it's rather easy to deduce the literary relationship, which one influenced which. So the idea of Tannin and Rahab is much older than Israel's history with Egypt. Assyria in Isaiah 27:1, and also the history with Babylon in Jeremiah 51, verse 34, who are seen in the light of the much older myth. The point I'm trying to make is the Bible wasn't written with this metaphoric idea that Pharaoh, Babylon, Assyria are just sea monsters, and it's just metaphorical. The idea of the sea monster myth, is literally more than 1,000 years older, probably possibly more, even older than 2,000 years older than the writing of the ideas, and even the supposed historical contact between Israel, Egypt, Babylon, and Assyria. Sorry, not supposed historical. Some of it is absolutely historical. The point is the myth was first. And these accounts of Egypt, Assyria, and Babylon, they draw on the myth. And that's pretty easy to show. They are all seen in the light of the old sea monster, the enemy, the arch old enemy of God. And no, this is not Satan. But anyway, he is worthy of all judgment, this thing. All right, leave you there today. Next week, we are going to move now across the boundaries of the Bible. You could make the argument, you could try and make the argument that all of this is just metaphorical language, beautiful poetry of how God beats his enemies. And you could do that if we didn't have all the ancient accounts of this of this Chaos Kampf motif, where the gods fight the sea monsters to create or to be enthroned. And that we'll look at next week. We'll go outside the boundaries of the biblical accounts to see what the ancient context for this motif looks like. Thanks so much for joining me. We're on Substack. I'll put some small articles up on Substack concerning a different issue. 4-minute reads at a time. They're a little bit controversial, but they summarize some of the archaeological biblical evidences for the origins of Yahweh and how things have developed. Check it out. Cheers.